sister is. So
yeah, right.
Yeah, I was just saying, I feel like this is one of those panels where it's relatively unlikely that I'm going to say anything, but
then we'll come back to
it'll haunt me.
Yeah, you never know.
Although I suppose we are talking about religion.
And a calendar.
All right.
Maybe.
It's seamless.
That's tricky.
Good morning, everybody. Would someone do us the favor of getting the door? Thank you. Welcome to the Bible as Fantasy Literature. My name is Ken Schneer. I am an author of science fiction and fantasy. I will be giving a reading for those who are interested tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. I'm reading a weird little story that's going to be in Lightspeed in a month or two. And I happen to have with me copies of my collection, The Law and the Heart. I also am a professor of humanities and legal studies at Johnson Wales University in Providence. The description of our panel reads as follows. What can we gain from viewing the Bible as fantasy literature, rife with active gods, prophecies, and larger-than-life heroes, and complete with centuries of fanfic from Dante to Milton and onward? How is the Bible treated in fantasy? I'm going to begin by asking the panelists to introduce themselves and also to say a word or two about their personal orientation toward this topic. I'll start with Matt today.
Okay. Hi, my name is Matthew Kressel. I'm the author of King of Shards. It's a contemporary epic fantasy based on a Jewish myth, the Lamed Vav, which we can get into. I had a story nominated for the Nebula this year, The Meeker and the All-Seeing Eye. A bunch of short stories that I've had around. My most recent is in Nightmare, Demon in Aisle 6. And I'm the co-host of the Fantastic Fiction at KGB Reading Series in New York City with Ellen Datlow.
Hi everyone, I'm MJ Kniff. Is the mic picking me up from here, or do I have
Yes.
to sort of, oh good, in Burroughs you have to like lean forward really to say anything. I'm MJ Kniff. I am a graduate student at Brown University studying English literature, which essentially means I'm studying Bible fan fiction. Bible fan fiction is one of my favorite types of old fan fiction, second to King Arthur. I am also a poetry editor at Strange Horizons, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs.
Hi, I'm Susan Weiner. I double majored in biology and Near Eastern Judaic studies. And I've written a couple of LARPs that are either set in biblical worlds or heavily use biblical tropes, and I'm really interested in that sort of play on biblical stories.
Hi, I'm Noah. I write under the name N.S. Dalkart, and my forthcoming debut novel is coming out from Angry Robot in 2016, June. It is 2016 already. It's coming out in June of this year, and it is itself based on the Bible, and in particular the older notions that you don't get in Sunday school, but do get when you read the text.
Very good. So let me start by asking people to cite, name at least one favorite example work of what we would call fantasy literature that uses either the Jewish or Christian scriptures as its source material, excluding C.S. Lewis, please.
Some of my favorite work is Isaac Bashevis Singer, who takes a lot of, I mean, not all of his work is this way, but he won the Nobel Prize in Literature, and a large body of his work is essentially Torah fan fiction. He takes all these myths, which a lot of them are apocryphal, folk tales, etc., and writes these wonderfully, just beautiful, elegant stories that really got me interested in doing some of that myself. But I think my favorite story is, and it's not really well known in the genre, it's called The Last of the Just by André Schwarz-Barr, a French author, and it's based on a Judaic myth called the Lamed Vav, which is essentially the idea that there are 36 anonymous saints upholding the world. It's a great book.
It's good.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I feel like we can't let this question by without mentioning his Dark Materials, which is.
I was hoping to mention
Yeah.
Milton before someone mentioned
Well,
his Dark
that's
Materials
fair.
for
I'm
chronology,
sorry.
but yeah.
Let's go backwards.
I actually feel like I have to go pretty traditional here, which is I want to talk about the Midrashim. Because even if you take things from a more literal perspective, the rabbis, so the Midrashim, for anyone who doesn't know, are stories that the rabbis wrote about the Bible and elaborating on the biblical stories. And many of them have very strong fantastical elements of giant frogs being eaten by giant sea monsters, being eaten by gianter birds. And many of them, the rabbis explicitly told us, were not to be taken literally. So these are explicitly fantasy stories with a moral perspective told about biblical stories.
MJ, you were going to say something about Milton.
Oh, Milton is just my favorite in general, but my favorite Bible fan fiction because he tried so hard to sort of justify God's ways to man, right? That's a quote from Paradise Lost, and yet he created such a compelling Satan that there's a reason why Milton's Paradise Lost has been inspiration for his Dark Materials, for Stephen Breast-Tureen and Hell, all of these works. It's because his Satan is just so good, totally accidentally. William Blake once said that Milton was of the devil's party without realizing it. So it's my favorite sort of accidental, he almost like fanficked himself.
If I could jump in on that, I heard at WonderCon, I think Ken Liu mentioned it, but somebody, I don't know who he was quoting, but he was quoting somebody as saying that their theory was that Milton was not accidental, that he intentionally made Satan so compelling a character because he wanted the reader to identify with Satan and then catch themselves and go, oh my God, I'm identifying with Satan. Paradise is truly lost. There really is this original sin within me that wants to identify with Satan.
It looks like we really are in Paradise Lost.
Yeah.
I know you said no C.S. Lewis.
No, just in the opening.
But I think we can't leave out Screw Tape Letters.
Sure.
Because, I mean, okay, everybody talks about Narnia, but Screw Tape Letters is just so much fun and so playful and so interesting. It's such a different perspective on that.
So, which going to the holy books themselves, which characters, settings, narratives from those books would you think present particularly good source material for, let's say, new fantasy work? And anyone can just jump in.
I have a favorite. My favorite comes from Genesis. It's in the Parsha Lech Lecha, for what it's worth. It's this part where Abraham has gathered the troops and gone off to fight on behalf of Sodom in order to rescue his nephew Lot. And he's gone and he's been successful and he's won this great battle and captured kings or whatever. And he gets back, and I forget who his ally is, but one of his allies says, here, take some of the stuff. And this ally of his is a priest of a god called El Elyon, which is it means God Most High, and it's a name that we have not seen up until now in the Bible. So we've started out where we've already got two names for God. We've got the Yod He Vav He, and we've got Elohim. And here we reach this new God, El Elyon. Haven't heard about him before, and this ally of Abraham's, who is a priest of God Most High, says to Abraham, blessed are you, and to God Most High, and here have some of the spoils of war. And Abraham, really interestingly, says back to him, "Blessed are you to Yod-He-Vav-He, to Adonai El Elyon." Blessed are you back to my God, who is God Most High. It fascinates me, this moment, because it can be seen in multiple different ways, but the way I like to see it is that these really are two distinct gods, and that Abraham is intentionally combining them as a sign of this pact between peoples. That he is combining El Elyon, God Most High, and his own God, and saying, you know, just as we are allies, surely, you know, we've been calling our God by different names, but it's the same God, obviously, because we're buddies, so it's the same God. The alternative way of looking at it is to say that they were the same God all along. This is very charitable to the text, but you could say that they're the same God all along, and that Abraham is alternatively saying to him, "You know him only as God Most High, but I know him by first name." So I find that to be a really fascinating glimpse at the sorts of relations between earth and the heavens.
And you see that as a jumping off point for a piece of
I see that as a jumping off point for fantasy. Certainly, in my fantasy, I have gods who are potentially the same god, or maybe they split off at some point.
So what I've thought about that's kind of related to that is, so, you know, if you watch the progression in the Bible from, you know, in the Torah and the 5 books, it's really clear that the perspective is God is our God, and there are other gods out there. And then as you're going into the prophets and kings, and later it becomes more, no, really, God is the only God. Stop worshiping all of these other gods. They're not real. Forget about them. And I've actually always had this concept of basically a war in heaven, that you can sort of combine this perspective of a war in heaven from the Christian perspective with that engulfing of these other gods. That these other gods are going from allies, enemies, you know, things to be treated with in various ways, to things that you cannot deal with. And I think there's a fascinating sort of overlap going on there.
MJ, you got one?
I think I'm going to have to say the infancy Gospels of Christ, just because he's such a profoundly important figure in our culture. But if you look at the infancy Gospels, he does some weird stuff, as, you know, children and adolescents do. And I think that would be, we get so many sort of two-dimensional heroes in bad fantasy literature, and I think maybe I want to set them all down and make them read the infancy Gospels of Christ and go, see, look, if Jesus Christ can have character depth, then your character okay? So I think that would probably be mine.
There's a lot of stories I love. One of my favorite is the story of the Shamir worm. So there was this prescription against using iron to build the Holy Temple, because iron could have been used to fashion a weapon of war. So you couldn't build a holy place with something that was used to presumably kill somebody. So the rabbi said, well, how could this be? So there arose this myth of this Shamir worm, this tiny little worm, which is ultimately a millipede, and then some people say it was uranium, and there's all these crazy theories, but essentially it had the power to split stone. It's this great story where King Solomon sends one of his men to capture Ashmedai, the demon Ashmedai, basically getting him drunk, and then wraps him in a chain which is engraved the holy name of God, and then brings Ashmedai back to the kingdom. And on the way back, and it really struck me the first time I read this, is that they they pass a wedding. Solomon's servant and Ashpenaz pass a wedding, and there's the wedding shoes there ready to be put on by the groom. And Ashpenaz begins crying, and the Solomon's servant says, "Why are you crying, Ashpenaz?" He says, "Well, you know, that man won't live through the day; he'll never be married." And I thought, wow, the king of the demons is weeping because a human being is not going to be married, and it just totally changed my perspective of, like, you know, our relationship with, like, evil characters, because there's so much fiction out there. It's just like, they're evil, hate them, you know, and it's kind of like what Milton did with Satan. It's like it presented this idea of, you know, evil might just be confusion or misunderstanding. I mean, obviously there's more to it than that, but that really struck me. So anyway, the story goes that Ashpenaz comes back to Solomon and then tells him the secret on how to capture the Shamir worm, which is basically held in a cave by this bird. But it's a great little story that just, to me, opened up, like, all these ideas.
I think it's worth noting in this context that Ashpenaz appears as a character in Matt's novel.
Yes, he does.
Yes. I want to put a plug in here for the character arc of King David, because you know, it's this gorgeous, innocent kid, you know, who comes to power not really understanding what he's getting himself into, and does what he can and makes all these really ultimately bad choices, including one especially bad choice, and ultimately, you know, toward the end is not, you know, able to fulfill his dreams, is not able to build the temple he wants to build, and, you know, the number of stories I have started that are based on that character arc, you know, because it strikes me as enormously compelling. So
Can I add something about King David?
Yeah, sure.
One of the things that inspired the beginning of my novel is that there's this bizarre part, and I'm trying to remember it clearly, but God basically gives King David a choice of punishments. He's got this choice, you know, you're going to be punished, and now here are your choices. He gets like 3 choices. And he chooses, I want to say, to be routed in battle or something, or have his forces defeated. But the really, the part that fascinated and horrified me is that the punishment that David receives is that all these other people are going to die. And David gets to live to fight and rule another day. And that's a big part of sort of what inspired my story, where a king gets punished by having everybody else die, and the king has to survive. And we have a question. I don't know.
Depending on, I'm going to take questions more toward the end of the period.
I just have a
No, I'm going to take.
about it, yeah.
Okay. It's depending on how much compassion the narrative invests in that character, that can work really well.
Exactly.
We leave it as an open question whether the narrative does invest David with that much compassion.
But it's still especially interesting considering that we don't have in the Hebrew Bible any notion of an afterlife beyond Sheol, which is this place that is not described. So these people are presumably dead forever, or dead.
I mean,
until the end.
there's lots of examples of someone being punished, of the focal character being punished by other people suffering. I mean, Lot's the classic example.
Although Job is also.
Sure. So I want to.
Right, sorry, Joe.
I want to throw us a curve here. So I read, you know, necessarily as a short story writer, I read a lot of submission guidelines, and the submission guidelines for Clarkesworld magazine have a list of various story types which are, quote, likely hard sells, end quote, things that, you know, it's going to be much harder to sell. And one of those stories is this. It says, quote, stories that depend on some vestigial belief in Judeo-Christian mythology in order to be frightening, i.e. Cain and Abel are vampires, the end times are coming, communion wine turns into Christ's blood literally, it's HIV positive, Satan's going to get you, etc. Interestingly, those guidelines contain no similar warning concerning stories depending on some vestigial belief in other religions or mythologies. And I don't mean to pick on Neil personally, but first of all, to what extent is this sentiment commonly shared among science fiction and fantasy readers and editors? And secondly, if so, why? Why should we be, why should an editor say, we don't really want to hear stories about, based on Judeo-Christian mythology, but you want to base on the Upanishads, go ahead.
I can't speak for Neil himself. I do know him personally. I don't know why he wrote that particular thing. What I would think is that he probably gets a lot of stories like that, and maybe they don't particularly work for him. And I think the other reason is that people really don't like to be preached to. They don't want to read necessarily a story that's trying to convert them to a particular belief system, or that requires a particular belief in that mythology in order to have an effect on the reader. It might just be that Neil knows his demographic. If you're going for a different demo, maybe that's the type of story that you want to read. But Neil is probably in that case just speaking to his particular audience. That's what I would do.
I think to me, not knowing this person or these guidelines or how they were created, I think it stems from the basic assumption, which is true for a large majority of Western audiences and writers, but not all, that Judeo-Christian beliefs are the ones they grew up with. It's sort of the basics. Whereas, for example, Greek gods, you'd be coming at that from an artistic perspective, because of course, no one is actually pagan anymore. I am actually pagan, so I'm not saying that truthfully, but I think there is, and of course then all of these non-Western religions which don't even bother to be mentioned, the flip side of that is that there probably are less people submitting bad stories about non-Western religions to Clark's World, and so it's probably still slightly fresher, but I think there is that sort of basic assumption that this is sort of foundational for literature in English in a way that other religions and mythologies cannot be because of racism. I'm just going to get that out there.
So I do think that when you're dealing with a mythos that a large number of your readers have very strong experiences with, whether they believe it, whether they had bad experiences with it, whatever that is, there is a delicate balance, especially in a place where you're not necessarily expecting to find those things. Between, if you're writing something where you're really expecting that your readers believe in this, then it may not be nearly as evocative to people who don't. Whereas if you're writing something where you expect your readers don't believe in it, you may be writing things that people who do believe in it find offensive or insulting or hard to deal with. So there's this really, you're threading a delicate balance, and you're likely to upset people or put off people one way or the other if you're in a setting where people aren't expecting it. And I don't think it can't be done well, but I do think that it may be a more delicate thing to play with than most things are, because you're going to be writing probably from one of those perspectives. Perspectives of belief or non-belief. Yeah. Yet again, I'm pushing a little bit on this. I think something MJ mentioned, in passing. We don't have that problem with the Greek pantheon. Well, right? Because you're generally people are writing from a perspective of non-belief on that. Right, but they're not offended by it, right? In a way that they are offended by non.
I think it's a majoritarian thing, right? It's this notion that because there are so few people in the world today who are believing in the Greek pantheon or in whatever, that you can therefore get away with just assuming that everybody is starting from a point of non-belief and making it whatever you want to make it, but you start from this point of saying, well, we're all on the same page here that this isn't real, but and I think that's
it's a huge rhetorical difference, right? Because
Yeah.
if you're already like if you're writing a story where it hinges on the belief that Zeus is a real god or an existing being, and then the impact of the story is dependent upon that. That's a very different story from
Absolutely.
one that is just okay. We're working with a myth that most people realize, or believe, or
And you know
whatever
what?
you want to say, is not is fiction essentially.
If
So that's a huge rhetorical difference when you're
Yeah.
dealing with something.
If I can throw out a book that comes from the assumption that the Greek gods are real, Apuleius has the Golden Ass, one of the Metamorphosis books that is just about novel length, and comes from the absolute assumption that Aphrodite is real, and ends with like a paean to Aphrodite. Those things are out there, but I do think that that it's an ugly thing, this sort of majoritarian. We can all be on the same page that those things aren't real, so you can be very non-controversial while playing with the Egyptian gods or the Greek pantheon or the Norse pantheon, whereas everybody sort of walks on eggshells around the Bible. And I do think that there needs to be more of a place for Bible fiction rather than less of a place for the rest of it, because I think that's the only way you can really expect to equalize it. Is even though there may or may not be a little more controversy around it. I do feel that there's a very strong danger to the kind of tippy-toeing around Christian beliefs in particular, more so than Jewish beliefs. But when I think about it, I think of Stargate, for example, where the Egyptian gods and the Norse gods and whatever gods you want to be out there, right, are all aliens of various sorts. But somehow there isn't an alien who is God from the Bible, right? There's even an alien who decides that he's the devil, but there's no alien who is God from the Bible, because we have to leave that part for true belief, right? We get the same thing with Neil Gaiman with his Sandman, where all these gods are characters, and they're all running around, and some of them are weak and some of them are strong and some of them kill each other. But the God, right, is still there, unknowable in the heavens with angels, and I really think that that's a dangerous thing.
Yeah, I just want to address the sort of weasel word in that guidelines of Judeo-Christian, as if they just don't mean Christian, as if they don't just mean probably a specific subset of sort of white Protestant Christianity. The people who say Judeo-Christian don't view Catholics as Christian, and they would probably be fine if I were to submit something based on the Deuterocanonicals, not that I would. But especially because there is so much sort of material from Judaism that Christians are not aware of unless they are huge religious studies nerds. Material that is still, I think, really fresh in our culture because it is not the majority sort of belief the way that the Gospels are. But there's this sort of desire to sort of just grab Jews and drag them along into Christianity. I always find really suspicious, and so whenever I hear Judeo-Christian, I'm like,
we're good luck charm.
I think it's fair to say that the term Judeo-Christian is largely a misnomer.
And I think the percentage of American Jews who are likely to be upset by entertaining fiction about the Jewish stories is a lot lower. For one thing, because we have so many of them.
Sorry, Samantha,
I just was, taking an opportunity to plug a friend's anthology. They're doing an anthology of Christian fiction, Mysterium.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And it's speculative fiction from
John and Kristen.
Yeah,
They're right
Kristen
over there.
Jans and Donald Crenshaw.
Right.
And
Hi.
yeah, it's called
They're right
Mysterium.
there.
I think, and it's kind of what we're talking about. It's speculative fiction with Christian mythology and Christian themes, which, you know, like we were just talking about how, you know, maybe Clark's World in particular may not be looking for that type of story, and we're kind of tiptoeing around this in the genre. Like, you know, there are, of course, an enormous number of myths that we could explore that haven't been explored. I don't believe that, you know, Christianity's been completely explored. You know, in my stuff I do Judaic myths, but, you know, there's room for a lot of this.
I think that you know, maybe we've already dealt with this, but so you're sensitive, not you personally, but one is sensitive around issues concerning Christianity in particular, because either one doesn't want to step on toes or one does want to step on toes, but either way, there's the toe stepping that is involved. And the reason why you don't feel that way about, you know, you speak about the Greek pantheon, that's nice and safe, but other religions that currently have adherents, the reason you don't feel that way about that is because there are none in your neighborhood, you know, and so there's
Yeah, why can we write about Hindu myths?
Yeah.
I've certainly read stories about Hindu myths.
There's actually
there's a
trouble for that before.
yeah. So there's a colonialist aspect to this,
Mm-hmm.
where you know, and when you do, there's a cultural appropriation problem,
Mm-hmm.
right? In a way that you don't worry about a cultural appropriation problem when it's your own culture.
But yeah, but if I can add something about this if we haven't beaten this to death already about the Judeo-Christian values, is that it, as bad as it is, and as annoying as it is for me as a Jew to hear phrases like Judeo-Christian values used to really talk about Christian values, there's another aspect, which is that the phrase Judeo-Christian values is very intentionally leaving out Muslim values.
Absolutely. I like to get to.
And that is really rather horrifying.
Yeah.
Because for one thing, the distance in time between the beginnings of Christianity and the beginnings of Islam are so much closer than between Christianity and Judaism. The worlds that these religions come out of are so different. And
Depending on where you count the beginning of Judaism to be. I mean, talk about
yes, absolutely.
Pharisaic Judaism.
That's fair.
Too far off.
That's fair.
Okay.
However, there's, you know, to talk about Judeo-Christian values when Jesus is a character in Islam and not in Judaism, you know, where Mary is a saint in Islam and not in Judaism, like I find that to be really telling.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, there was a wonderful quiz out there recently on the internet where they took two similar translations and asked you to tell which passages from the Bible and which passages from the Quran.
Yeah.
And if you're not really used to looking at the wording and noting the details of how they tend to word things differently, it's really hard. There's a lot of the same stories and a lot of the same laws. You know, and so absolutely the fact that we don't include that in that phrase is really off-putting. And I was actually hoping that we might touch a little bit on Quranic stories. Because there are some wonderful stories in the Quran that are absolutely ripe for play in terms of, you know, some of the things coming out of that. And it's one of those, like, I want to read more of those stories. I'm not the person to write them, but I really want to see more of those stories coming out. There's some really great things in there. There's some great pieces in there, just like there are in the Bible.
In short, especially in science fiction and fantasy short fiction, there's been a lot of good stuff, or not as much as there should be. But there have been a number of really good Islamic fantasy short fictions.
Usman Malik, right? And then
Usman
Amal al-Mukhtar.
And Saladin.
Saladin.
Yeah,
Saladin.
Yeah.
Has written a lot of good stuff. And even some by non-Muslims, which has been pretty respectful and interesting. So, you know, it's out there. So I want to talk to specifically to Matt, Susan, and Noah because you've all written fiction, which is in fact based one way or another on holy books, and ask about benefits and drawbacks. You know, as a writer writing that kind of work, using this material, what's good about it, what's not so good about it. So I'll start with Susan, and then go Matt and Noah.
So I'm going to cheat just a little bit because my better known game that's based on the Bible is actually science fiction, not fantasy, because parables are amazing. It's a game that's written in a near-future eco-apocalypse scenario, centered around a Passover Seder taking place at the house of controversial eco-terrorist leader Chris Carpenter, called The Last Seder. So, you know, that's sort of playing with the story of the Exodus and the story of the life of Jesus. And I've really enjoyed watching the way, because I write LARPs, watching the way that different players have evoked this and seeing sort of the way that people's conceptions of Jesus affects the way they play the character of Chris Carpenter. That I found we tend to get a very different portrayal depending on whether that person is a believing Christian, a believing Jew, we've had a pagan play this person, or a non-believer. We get very different portrayals, and I find it fascinating. And the other work that I've written on this was set actually in a fantastical interpretation of before the flood. All of the peoples that were destroyed by the Noah flood, and looking at sort of the ideas that magic exists, but magic is dependent on God. And so that it's all about sort of what your relationship was with God, and all of these different peoples who had different relationships with God and had magic coming out of that in this fantastical pre-flood scenario.
Yeah.
You know, I think the main, obviously, like, one of the greatest benefits of it was just the rich amount of source material. There's just an enormous amount. I mean, it's a rabbit hole, and it was wonderful. And I did all this research, and then when I sat down to write the book and create a coherent cosmology, I found that there were certain times where either two myths were irreconcilable, or things didn't quite fit. So what I found was that it was better to just use these myths as jumping off points and not let myself be constrained by them. And I would refer to them when I was building up the world. But once I had the world created, it was like, okay, well, the myth says this one thing, but I kind of want to take it here because that's what the story needs, that's what the story deserves. And so I moved away from the myth. So the issue for me was just knowing when to divert from the well-known narrative, the well-known mythology. And it was both fun and terrifying. It's fun because I'm like, wow, these myths are so cool, and then terrifying, like, people are gonna be like, well, that's not exactly how the myth goes. It says the other things. Well, yes.
That is like writing fanfic.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying.
But that's not canon.
No?
Well, I love writing writing based on the the Torah, or at least what I have. But I think to some degree, I think it's easier for me because, unlike Matt, I'm not basing things on text. I'm not basing on my novel on on the world we are given in the Torah. I'm more basing my fantasy world on the ideas that come to mind when I look at the Torah. So I think I have a little more opportunity to adopt whatever I like and throw some things out and just take something from idea that I had reading Greek myths instead. But at the same time, it gives me all this fuel because I can be like, ooh, in the sequel, I can have them all start keeping kosher, which is gonna happen, people. I have somehow in my world, it makes sense for book 2 to include a logical conception of kashrut. But I can do that because I'm not basing it strictly on a text or on characters that you get in the Bible.
Susan, you were going to say something?
One thing that I've definitely found to be an interesting challenge with this that I've worked hard at in the games that I've written on this is I love putting in those things where the more you know, the more you're going to get out of it.
Yeah.
Where,
Easter eggs.
Those Easter eggs, yes, Easter eggs, where if you know the stories, you're going to make all of these connections. And I love seeing, again, because I get to see my players in LARP as opposed to not see the readers, I love seeing people put these pieces together, but writing it in such a way that it's also accessible to someone who doesn't have more than the sort of basic knowledge that everyone in our culture has is something I'm also striving for. So that balance of, pulling in and really exciting the people who get those references while still being fun, interesting, and accessible to the people who don't have that knowledge is an interesting challenge.
Well, what was also fun as I was writing was like I had certain people tell me, I'm not familiar with Judaic mythology, but I wasn't sure which ones you made up and which ones were real, and I was
Hooray.
Yeah. This next one I'm going to start with MJ, because she's the lit crit person here. So you've got a lot of fiction. I mean, I almost want to say all fiction, which uses as its jumping off point some of the text. Especially in fantasy and science fiction, where it may be Shakespeare that's jumping off point. It may be King Arthur, as you mentioned. That's the jumping off point. Is literature that uses a holy book as its jumping off point in some way categorically different or categorically same as literature that uses any other revered text as a jumping off point?
I don't think it's categorically different, but I think it often is different. Oftentimes, less true now, but for the majority of works that have been written that really engage with Judeo-Christian mythology, there is some sort of stance I've noticed that people are taking. I don't think that is required of the text, but I do think, but you could say the same about King Arthur. Usually there is some sort of stance someone has on the issue of sovereignty, kingship, British exceptionalism, whatever, what have you. Oftentimes, if someone is using a text that is so widely ingrained in our culture, they are hoping to exploit those associations to further whatever agenda they have. I'm not sure there's a categorical difference between people using the Bible and people using King Arthur, say, in that. And I think you can write works that don't do that, but most people don't.
Others?
I don't know if I can give quite the same analysis. just in terms of my depth of awareness of others' use of literature, but I will say that I think it just comes down to what I said earlier, like it's a rhetorical thing. I think if you take as a starting point, like this is a real thing, it's a very different reading experience from someone who takes it as this is a work of fiction riffing off of another work of fiction. So I think it's how you approach the text that really makes the most.
You know, I've taken the position for a long time that all fiction is fan fiction, at least to some degree, because all fiction, it's very, very difficult to write something that's not referential. It's very difficult that doesn't have, you know, a phrase, a setting, a character that is not in some way, if only unconsciously, based on other texts that you've written, you've read, and at some point you get to a point where, depending on how referential you are, where the reference becomes vexed or controversial in some way. You know, in contemporary fanfic, it's yes, when you deviate too far from canon, or what people perceive to be canon, or people want to be canon, you know, then you start getting you know, angry arguments. In the case of King Arthur, there are some knockdown drag-out arguments about stories based on King Arthur. Which version of the story, you know, is the version, you know, you hold close to your heart? And I guess I'm kind of operating on the assumption that if someone has there's almost no one in this culture who doesn't have a position on Christianity. It's either I believe, or I disbelieve, or I radically don't say whether I believe or disbelieve. You know, but everybody has a position. You know, and so it seems to me, because I haven't observed this, but just psychologically, it seems to me we'd have to have, you know, more vast stories than, I don't know, than with King Arthur.
I think a way that that sort of gets mediated is by the time someone is writing their Shakespeare fan fiction or their King Arthur fan fiction, they're already invested enough to have a strong position. So maybe, I think that, I think you're right that the majority of people in sort of Western culture probably have a stronger relation to Christianity than they do to Shakespeare or King Arthur, but by the time people are writing, usually people who are writing fan fiction are really invested in the thing. So we're sort of looking at a limited pool of people, the people who want to sit down and write a story about something.
Right.
And the people who will go and then edit that story is quite another step. But just to riff a little bit off of your statement that, you know, that everything is sort of referential, even unconsciously. I realized recently, like 2 or 3 weeks ago, that the 5 main characters of my story, you know, who are, I mean, they're based on D&D characters. Okay, so you'd think, right, that I didn't put that much of my unconscious, you know, upbringing into them, but you know, I realized like 2 weeks ago that, you know, hey, they're sort of the 4 children from the Passover Seder, but 2 of them are the simple child, you know, and it's just like, you know, there's so much that's going on in our heads that we're, you know, we almost can't help but make references.
So this is the magical part of the evening where we get to talk to the audience. So we just
Hooray!
Yes.
Yeah, I actually had just had a brief comment on when you brought up the story about where King David chose a punishment where his army got routed in battle.
Yeah.
I just wanted to bring the perspective that this may be coming from a time period where if there is not actual palace economy, it was going to be pretty close to palace economy, where you have the overall perspective that everything within the kingdom is the king's by right. So when his army is routed, that's a direct punishment to David himself, as opposed to like just to other people.
Oh, absolutely. I just want to make it clear that
But yes, it's
God
very interesting from a
that
modern
God
perspective.
in the Bible is totally cool with collateral damage. God in the Bible has no problem with collateral damage. I mean, the God in the Bible tells Moses, before he sets out to talk to Pharaoh, he tells Moses, okay, Moses, here's the plan. I want to stomp on these Egyptians, and I want to stomp on them hard. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart so that he will not let the people go until I've given him these 10 plagues. So, you know, I mean, that God is totally comfortable with the notion that in order to punish the king, God will kill masses.
You see that theme in a lot of action films where the hero survives,
Yes.
but then the last Superman film, people complain that all this collateral damage, or even the last Star Trek film.
Well, and this is where you get wonderful midrashim of rabbinic apologists trying
Oh,
to
yeah.
explain why all of those people actually deserved what was coming to them.
And then the rabbis, especially my favorite one, the story in Prophets of Elisha and the bears, where a bunch of kids run out of the city and say, "Hey, get out of here, Baldy!" And Elisha curses them in the name of God, and 2 bears come out of the woods and eat the kids. And the rabbis go out and say, they don't even make a midrash for this one. They say, there's no bears, there's no woods. The rabbis come out and say, this entire thing is a fiction, never happened.
Okay, that's really nifty. I just wanted to comment that the similarity that Moses is a really speaking talking about which parts of the scriptures can be useful as fantasy. Moses is a great superhero story.
Oh, yeah.
It's yes.
So this is a little bit more from the publishing side. I was pleased and surprised to hear you mention Isaac Bashevis Singer, for example, as a fantasy novelist. Clearly he is, but certainly when I was growing up, all that stuff was just Jewish. And there was hardly a famous old Jewish author, as opposed to somebody who was being very deliberately postmodern, who wasn't writing what you could call fantasy. And I think that's maybe one of the big dividing lines between Jewish and Christian is that, you know, as several people pointed out, the Jewish text has always been comfortable playing around with fiction and belief in the same text. So my question is, in this little tiny universe of this panel, was there a shift, or has there been a shift in fantasy publishing world where, you know, I've seen it with other cultures too. A lot of the Chinese literature I used to read maybe would get called magical realism. Now it's being called fantasy. How does that, and has there been a shift, and what's happening on the marketing end where people who come from cultures in which there is not a hard dividing line between serious literature and this?
I can only speak from like just in terms of the Jewish myth. Like I know Jack Dan did the Wandering Stars anthologies. Like so that was.
And there have been several of those.
There have been 2 of them, I think, and you know, Levi Tidar is like a current author who deals a lot with Jewish myths. You know, I've only been writing fiction for about 13, 14 years, so I haven't been around long enough to say like a trend in publishing. I think there is this idea that like, yes, we'll take magic realism and we'll take, you know, religious fiction and we'll take this, and this is all under the speculative fiction umbrella. Anyone else?
Well, I would want to comment that I think there is, I mean, at least in the conversations I have with editors, publishers now, and authors now, when we mentioned, just off the top of our heads, 3 friends of ours who are writing Islamic fantasy literature, I think that there is not about belief per se, but there is an awareness that the landscape that is available for science fiction and fantasy literature is a whole lot bigger than people for several decades have let themselves understand, and that there's now an eagerness, maybe not as much eagerness as there should be, but there is the beginning of an eagerness to begin to reach beyond, what we've called, little thing we've called fantasy literature, which is basically, much of which is reworked Tolkien,
There has been a definite conscious attempt to increase diversity in the field, and that word, diversity, is weighted with all sorts of, its own, cultural references, but the idea is basically, not necessarily white authors, not necessarily Christian authors, not necessarily English-speaking authors. Like, just let's bring in everybody that we haven't been paying attention to.
Well, let's start doing it.
Trans and LGBTQ and all that stuff. Like, let's all open up to all these ideas that we may not have been paying attention to. So perhaps, religious fiction is in there, and that's just a theory.
I think on the other side of this question, there is still literature with fantastical elements that's being published as Jewish literature, not as fantasy. Has anyone here read Ruth Calderon's A Bride for One Night? It's a series of stories based on Talmudic stories, but mainly based on the perspective of the women in them. And some of them have fantastical elements because they're those Talmudic midrashim. And she's not afraid to deal with that. There are lots of those pieces, just like there are in the rest of these midrashim that I've been talking about.
I just wanted to, so back at the beginning when you were discussing the why do we have other, lots of stories about kind of other mythologies that people are very afraid about, Christian mythologies, you brought out Hindu stories about Hinduism, and I just wanted to mention there was actually an example I was thinking of where someone got in trouble because they were like, oh yeah, no one's going to think that Hinduism is real. There was a boba that published one of the playable characters was based on Shiva, I believe it was, and there were a lot of Indian people who got really upset about it, and the publishers were just like, oh yeah, it's fine because it's not Christianity, so no one's gonna care.
No one here will care, right? Which is not even
true.
true.
Turned out people did care.
Anybody want to respond to that?
Yeah, I just think that stories that feature religious content or that are inspired on religious content, those are good things, but I do think that it is not necessarily a good thing that white Christian authors should be doing. That can get really, really dicey, and I do think that people should be careful if they are of the majority culture that has spent centuries pillaging and enslaving every other culture, that maybe you should be careful what gods you deal with in your...
It's not to say don't do it, it's just to say be very, very careful, be respectful, do your research, have conversations with people who actually understand stuff better than you do, and before you...
Google Writing the Other.
Google Writing the Other, yes.
Yes, which is a fantastic book. And if you don't know anyone who actually believes the things you want to write about, maybe you are not the right person to be writing about that. Maybe you haven't been exposed to it as much as you maybe think you have.
If I can make a little note about respect and capitalization, something that I see all the time when you look at descriptions of a book or any number of things is that for the most part, the word gods in the plural is not capitalized. And yet when you talk about God, it's always capitalized with a him or a her or whatever, also capitalized. And to some degree that, I fought against that in my book, because in my book's polytheistic society where everybody's running around, there are all these gods and they're all trying to kill you.
So capitalize their names.
Yeah, exactly. Their God is always capitalized. Doesn't matter which god or gods they're talking about. They're always him, her, theirs. It's always capitalized. Not not because anybody believes in the gods that I've made up, because I've just made them up. I haven't even taken, you know, gods out of some supposedly dead pantheon. But just as a sign of the respect that the characters in my world are paying to these gods, and just sort of to show how serious they, the characters, are about these gods, I felt I had to capitalize every mention of a god or any god or his or hers or theirs.
Okay, back there. I'm sorry, you?
Me? Okay. You kind of touched on this already, but on the opposite spectrum. If somebody's writing about the Bible, because you're talking about how it should be more open to people writing about not just the Old Testament, but the New Testament as well. If somebody has strong beliefs about Jesus, for example, good or bad, but they don't actually know the materials, would it even make it past the publisher if they if they made, I don't know, Jesus a drunkard, but if they did it in a way that it actually followed the Bible, and they could show that they had the knowledge versus that they knew that the actual material already versus not knowing the material at all and not really knowing what they were talking about.
I mean, the good and bad news is that all publishers are people. And so to some degree, if you write something really well, then you always have hope of finding the publisher who really finds your story fascinating, and who thinks that your story is not only fascinating but will sell. And if they think that the story is going to be intensely controversial, then that's always a risk. It's a risk that people will be exceptionally mad at them and burn their books, but there's also a reward of the potential for the book to make headlines because it's so controversial and then everybody buys it. So I hesitate to say that anything can or can't be published as long as it's not plagiarism.
Yeah, I just ask because it's on the one hand, you guys are saying we should open up the Bible, the Bible to having that explored, and I'm not disagreeing with you there. But on the opposite side, I forget your name in the middle. You said, and if I butcher what you just said, please forgive me. But on the opposite side, you're saying if a white Christian person somehow doesn't do their research about anything else because of past, that's not okay. So I guess I'm seeing this weird juxtaposition between what you guys are saying.
I do think if Christianity didn't want to be culturally appropriated, they shouldn't have come in with swords everywhere in the world and forced people to convert. Because Christianity is the majority religion and because it has been the religion of colonialism, I say this as descendants of the people who did it, you can't complain, I think, as much about a majority religion being appropriated because you can't appropriate something that has been forced upon you. Christianity has been forced upon everyone in Western culture to some extent or another.
They'll complain anyway, though.
So
yeah, they will, but
they shouldn't.
Yes.
Another orientation toward that, having to do with the question of what you know and what you don't know, is that just speaking again from the publishing and writing standpoint, editors don't like pieces of fiction that are written by people who do not know what they're talking about on any topic.
That's true.
On any topic at all.
I think
But
that's
what the distinction that you're drawing is to make that judgment about an author or piece of work, the editor, him or herself, has to know about that topic. So there was this article I read in a commentary, an analog 40 years ago, where the editor was saying, no science fiction reader would tolerate, somebody getting up on the Empire State Building and looking at Alpha Centauri because science fiction readers would know that Alpha Centauri is in the southern hemisphere, and you can't see Alpha Centauri from the Empire State Building. Yet they are willing to have people mutating in front of them because they don't understand biology. Well, since that time, science fiction readers and editors know more biology and do object to that. And then the issue was, well, you don't understand linguistics, or you don't understand psychology. And so as things move on, you know, editors and authors get a broader and broader understanding of various things. So your question about the Christianity, to the extent the editor knows Christianity and recognizes you know what you're talking about, you know, the editor's going to say, I don't like this because you don't know what you're talking about. Sorry.
But at the same time, if they did know what they were talking about, but still went on that direction, then obviously that might be a different story.
Yeah, and I do think that you can demonstrate knowledge of something you're referencing. You can cite, you can reference, you can put in Easter eggs, whatever. But for a story that doesn't seem to display that knowledge, that could be because someone has never read the source text and has no idea what they're talking about, or it could be because someone has and wants to go in a completely divergent direction because that's fresh and interesting. It's hard to look at something and say, well, your Jesus isn't the canonical Jesus, so you must not know the canonical Jesus, rather than you are reinterpreting the figure.
I also think that you're looking for a general answer, and I think that every editor will be different. I think every editor will treat it differently.
I was just curious to...
Kristen.
So maybe I can comment on this, since my husband and I are both Christians and are editing an anthology of fiction, short speculative fiction at Young Christianity. We have received submissions from people of many faith backgrounds, and we certainly rejected a lot of stories where on the grounds of it's not like they'll be about Christian characters, but it's not clear to us that this author has ever met a Christian, and if they have, they probably don't like any of them. So, I mean, if it's about Christian characters, it's not. I think for me, when I'm thinking about how people who aren't necessarily of my faith are interpreting my religion, like the majority religion of the culture, I don't think of it personally in terms of cultural appropriation, but in the same way that I think of, you know, I also have a background as a chemist, so if it's about science and the story is based on chemistry, and it makes no sense whatsoever, then I'm going to be a harsher judge of that. Yeah. So it's kind of like, it strikes me as like, if the characters aren't, or don't actually remind me of any actual Christians that I know, even if the portrayals kind of make me cringe because I wish it wasn't true, but yeah, you kind of are like that sometimes. I mean, that's okay, but it's kind of like, if all of the Christians feel like cardboard caricatures of evil, then, you know, there are certainly tropes that are very popular among people who maybe have a negative idea of Christianity that you see over and over again, like there's the evil minister, and there's the imposing Christianity with the sword, and it's not like those aren't true, those don't exist, it's just that, like, it's kind of nice to see something different from that, and if somebody's going to reinterpret biblical material or write about the history of the church, like, it's good to see that they seem to have an understanding of that. I don't know if that helps.
And that's advice fresh off the slush pile, right?
Yeah.
This is what you've been reading for the last 6 months.
Incidentally, if you want to see more, you know, biblically or Christian-inspired fantasy and sci-fi out there, then I would encourage you to buy a copy of Mysterion when it comes out, and then maybe they'll do another anthology.
I would also encourage any writers who are relatively new to volunteer as a slush reader for a magazine. Many of them will take volunteers, and then you will, once you're on the other side of the transom, so to speak, you'll very quickly see the type of stuff that comes in, and then you'll understand those guidelines a lot better.
Yeah, because typically when an editor says, I don't want to see X, it's because she has seen so much X that she can't stand to look at one more. That's usually the reason. Yes?
I have a question about the Bible, actually, and it's as a fantasy novel. So, you know, sometimes you're reading a fantasy novel and having a good time, and then the author does something where you you can't suspend disbelief anymore. It's something that's just so brainless. It's like, what? You're just thrown right out of the novel. Have you ever had that experience when reading the Bible?
Well, the problem with that is that you're suggesting that there's an author. The Bible is in many ways more like a compilation of stories than it is like a novel. And some of them tie together very well, and some of them not quite so much, because there's a number of authors and we can pull them apart to varying degrees.
I mean, and if you want something like self-contradiction, I mean,
the first two stories.
I can't tell you where exactly, but I'm pretty sure that at some point Jesus mentions the patience of Job. And everybody knows about the patience of Job and how he was so patient, you know, through all of his travails and whatever. And then you read the book of Job, and he's like the least patient person you've ever met. You know, what you definitely have is different interpretations of the same thing, and it's sort of a mystery how we got the ones we ended up with.
And speaking as a writer, internal contradiction within a text is sometimes a feature, not a bug.
It's true. It's true. That way you get to choose which one you like.
I mean, there's all sorts of wonderful explanations as to why the world was created twice. I mean,
oh, that's true. A bunch of midrashim and all kinds of stuff.
There.
So you talked about willing to suspend disbelief. How far can you actually take that as somebody who draws from religious canon to expect people to understand that you're taking this as not necessarily coming from a religious standpoint, but approaching it from this is an interesting story that I'd like to explore more?
Well, in my particular case, I approached this as a portal fantasy quest. So I was using the tropes of fantasy fiction to write this. So I think, and it's very much marketed as a fantasy novel. So when people approach the book, you know, I want them to be reading from that mindset, not, you know, I'm reading another midrash. You know, and I think again it goes to how you approach text.
I think a lot of writers, you know, you get the bug in your ear to do this particular thing, and you don't really analyze why you're doing it so much as,
Yeah, that's true.
I want to write this story right now. You know, I've written a story quite to my own surprise that featured the Virgin Mary and the Archangel Gabriel as characters. You know, and if you had ever asked me, will you ever write a story like this, I would have said, absolutely not. I have no interest in writing stories of that kind. Yet the idea came, and the story came out, and there it was. You know, so I mean, I think there's not necessarily as much cognition or volition behind it.
I don't think this is necessarily helpful in terms of advice, but I always find that my ability to suspend my disbelief is entirely based on my assessment of the author's intentions and skill. And it doesn't have as much to do with the story itself, which might be crazy, as it does with my assessment of where the author is going with this. Because, like, you know, I was reading a book a while ago, and you know, there was a male character who was like this ridiculous fantasy of what masculine virility is. And I was reading and going like, okay, when is he going to flip this? And after about 120 pages, I was like, he is not going to flip this. I am not interested in this book. So, you know, it comes down to where you think the author is going with this, I think.
Okay, we have one time for one more question.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the genre, but I was just curious about Christian apocalyptic fiction, which again seems to have separate publishers, separate world, and I've never really, maybe opinions exist, but I've never seen it represented at any convention. Right. So I'm just kind of curious about. I'm taking it from what I'm hearing from people that you're not writing Christian apocalyptic fiction, and it seems to be very contrived from what I know, and I'm just kind of interested in your thoughts.
I mean, it's very interesting. There are sort of little publishing worlds that we don't always. I personally haven't read the Left Behind series.
I have. I wouldn't recommend it.
No.
All right. But yeah, they have their own. They often have their own little like world. There's definitely a Jewish publishing world that is like totally disconnected from the mainstream publishing world. And you can write a Jewish fantasy and then try to submit it to both worlds, and they're like, they don't communicate with each other, which it's very interesting.
I think a lot of Christian apocalyptic fiction, and I went to Catholic school for 14 years, so I read a lot of it, it has an intent, it has an agenda, it has a moral, the writing comes secondary to the moral of the story, and that means that the writing is often very flat, very two-dimensional. The characters who are the chosen ones just happen to all know each other, so they can come together. Genre won't like that, not necessarily because it takes Christianity seriously, but because it is not very good writing, and because it cares more about the Christian part than the fiction part.
I've seen that on the Jewish side too, at least in the children's books. You can write a children's book and have a hell of a time publishing it, but if it's a Jewish children's book, apparently you can get it published because there are some dreadful ones out there.
So on that note, we have to end. Thank you all so much.